Well, in terms of my comments, will be about first thank the two speakers about bringing the question of Bandung in relation to China. I'm going to comment on each of the paper and then try to tease out the common theme. Well, the first paper by Robert Louis, it's very interesting because I've never been to the Caribbean, so the information coming out from your talk, from your paper, is very, very informative. One sentence really strikes me from your paper, which I think both speakers here both want to welcome, try to reimagine a possibility of a new Bandung, but also I think both of you are very critical of what came out of the Bandung era. So Rupert is saying that there's no straight line, I'm quoting you, there's no straight line between Bandung 1955 and our present conjuncture. In fact, the echo is quite faint, and you almost forgot about it, right? So that's one important note, actually, why Bandung is, in some ways, for most people, is so irrelevant. So that's one issue that I'd like to note. The second thing I'd like to note from your talk is, I'm quoting you again, that the present conjuncture is experiencing, quote, a radical shift from the old power balances of the last half millennium. So last 500 years, you're seeing a big shift. Now, this evaluation of the present conjuncture, I think, is quite different from the one given by the next speaker, which I'll come to in a bit. So perhaps some kind of dialogue here may be interesting. And in the end of the talk, Rupert wants to bring back the project you imagining is strengthen regionalism among the Caribbean states. That's one. And you hope we can frame a project consistent with the Bandung ideas. So these are your suggestion. Huh? So back to Dr. Moyo's presentation. I'm going to combine today your talk about China in Africa, as well as the paper I read, which I highly recommend to all of you. The paper published in 2012 is highly relevant, in fact, for today's discussion. So in that paper, in fact, Moyo makes the question of primitive accumulation very central to understand the current dynamics of global capitalism, and brings the question. He brings the question in terms of discussion of Lenin and Luxemburg, how they debate about the role of primitive accumulation in relation to imperialism. And also there, I'm very glad he did it. He takes issue with David Harvey. Because David Harvey's framing of imperialism is, in fact, a kind of framework that very much shifts the problem of uneven development from the key question of core-peripheral relationship. Okay, so I have been a little bit unhappy with David Harvey's work myself, because when I was reading about his post-colonial critique, that book, I felt that for him, the whole evolution of, a postmodernist, sorry, not post-colonial, postmodernism is something sui generis within the West. Now, somehow the dynamics within West itself can generate the whole globalization, the whole spatial, temporal fix, etc. The fact that the presence of the socialist camp, the presence of the global South has been very much elided. You cannot find that in that book. So I'm very happy that Dr. Moyo here in that paper very much takes on David Harvey, actually makes very strong critique of it, David Harvey. By bringing back the global South in the whole global context of global dynamics. Now, the difference between the two of you is that I said Rupert thought that we are in a conjuncture of a very big change, a change that we haven't seen in the last 500 years. But Moyo actually is giving us a different kinds of periodization of where we are. So the first periodization, the first phase of development is from 1500 to 1800 in his paper. Okay, so that's 300 years of capitalism, first 300 years of capitalism. And there he would call this period as mercantilist, pre-industrial form of capitalism. And then second phase of capitalism is from, second stage of capitalism is from 19th century to 1945. And this is a new type of imperialism, or what he calls classical stage of monopoly capitalism. Now, where we are now is actually a not new stage, but a new phase, according to Dr. Moyo. We're in a new phase in which we have witnessed some kind of mutations. One of the mutations, of course, is the rise. I mean, if you read his paper, there are 3 or 4 mutations. But one mutation is the rise of the industrialized semi-peripheries, which includes China. And in the paper, he raised a very important question, which, again, I think both speakers raised today, is whether the emergence of the semi-periphery are subservient sort of regional stabilizers, or are they a force antagonistic to imperialism? I think that's a very, very important question, and it's a question that's especially important for China. Now, towards the end, Dr. Moyo raised his project. His project is to reclaim Pan-Africanist project. So Rupert has regionalism for the Caribbeans, and Dr. Moyo has Pan-Africanist vision for Africa on new terms. And also that new terms is towards a policy of self-reliance, but it's collective self-reliance, which is an interesting term. He didn't say national self-reliance, he said collective self-reliance. So it may be interesting, we can elaborate on that. And also a South-South solidarity based on a new strategy of non-alignment. So I've given you both the layout of their papers, but also the projects they try to imagine linking by trying to revive the Bandung legacy for the future. Dr. Moyo's today's talk is also interesting because he specifically focuses on China, the China question. So what I try to do is I'm going to talk a little bit of what I think of some of these issues. Well, I think on the question of China, perhaps Dr. Moyo gave 3 possible positions. One is recolonization discourse about China. The second one is creating room for maneuver. And the third one is which is his, Africa is facing classical scramble. My position, just based on my research, is that I think both 2 and 3 are happening, which is to say that China's presence in Africa has created some room for maneuver, but also China is part of the new scramble itself. And so here I'll just give you some examples. My research in Zambia and most recent trip to Zimbabwe. So in Zambia, China has heavily invested in, large picture first. China's trade with Africa has indeed shot up very rapidly, but China's trade with the US and Europe is even much larger. So let's not forget that. So while China's trade with Africa has become alarming, but a lot of people forget that China has done a lot more trade with the US and EU. China's investment in Africa, last time I checked, the figure was probably from year 2012. China's investment in terms of flow, FDI flow, is probably only ranked number 12th to 15th-ish. So it's not number 1, it's not even top 5 in that regard. So much of the discourse about China in Africa being so huge is exaggerated and is misrecognized. It's misrecognized in part because some of the Chinese trade are done by Chinese small traders. These are family shops. A lot of them are small shops. So in terms of, they seem numerous, that you see a lot of Chinese merchants on the streets. Really, yes, they do compete with African, retailers. But the matter of fact is, all it takes is one ShopRite from South Africa, right? I mean, China has not involved in any of the supermarket chains in Africa, but South African supermarkets is dominating in most of the Southern African countries. So that, we have to put that into perspective as well. How do we compare the presence of Chinese, numerous presence, I mean, Indians also, and it used to, before Chinese, there were lots of Indians as merchants as well. So I think I very much I reject the discourse that China is engaging in neo-colonialism and it doesn't stand to evidence. But the question is that China has very much benefited from the whole neoliberal framework, which China did not create, but China had benefited from it since mid to late 1990s to the present. That is the whole neoliberal agenda, which opened up Africa for scramble. In fact, China just came in at that juncture. China was trying to go out. China has surplus capital, surplus capacity, and surplus labor as well. So at the point when China wanted to go out, and here's a time of neoliberalism. And so China had benefit from it, so much so that, of course, in the case of Zambia, the entire copper industry itself, which used to be national, it's nationally owned, it's a state-owned enterprise, was dismembered and then was dismembered into 7 pieces and sold to multinational companies, and China was part of it. And China was a latecomer, but it was part of it. So China is very much, lived more or less comfortably in that kind of framework, right? And to this day. So that's my point number one. And I think when we think of China in Africa, we have to keep that in mind, that China has not challenged the global neoliberal system itself, economically. Now, politically, we can talk about it a little bit later, because politically, economically, they're not always aligned. So in that sense, that China is very much aware that China needs Africa politically. Now, Europe and US, they do not need Africa politically. But China does, because of China's own geopolitical position in the world. Now, but China, on the other hand, also provided some kind of small space of maneuver in Zambia, for example, and in Zimbabwe as well. For example, in 2007 and 2008, there was a global financial crisis, so a lot of Western companies pulled out of Zambia, leaving thousands of workers all of a sudden unemployed, and towns were dying. So in this case, the SOE, the state-owned enterprise from China, which has invested in Zambia, at that time they had one copper company. They made a vow. They vowed to do 3 no's, which is they're not going to cut on the investment. They will not stop any expansion, and they will not lay off any worker. So at that time, for most of Zambians, they're pretty happy to hear about that. So this commitment, this comes to a little bit sort of the social dimension that Samir Amin was talking about. So this commitment to 3 no's made some difference on the local scene. Because at this point, then Zambian government can say to Western companies, if you want to leave, fine, we got China, right? And indeed, some Western companies pulled out. There was a Swiss company pulled out, and then the Chinese SOE decided to expand and purchased that company. So this is the case where the small space of maneuver has been created for Zambia. In the case of Zimbabwe, in my last trip, I actually talked to the Chinese tobacco company. As you know, tobacco company in China is state-owned. So in Zimbabwe, when they entered, that was a time when Zimbabwe has been sanctioned. So what's interesting is that tobacco industry has been monopolized as well. That is, there's an auction floor, and there's a price ceiling, there's a price agreement basically among all the multinational companies. And when Chinese company came in, they actually broke that monopoly. And they raised the purchasing price of tobacco Then they also provided in the form of contract farming. They provided loans to local farmers, and those are local farmers. Some of them had newly gained land from the land reform. So they got loans, and the loans had much cheaper interest rate than the loans provided conventionally. So these are the small space of maneuver I think Chinese presence had provided. Yet, on the other hand, I think the main point we have to keep in mind is that if we are envisioning something bigger, China is not doing that. So I think the neoliberal framework is still there. Now, coming back to today's issue, how do we reflect on Bandung? I think there are several outcomes coming out of the Bandung era. One outcome is basic or BRICS countries. And I think that's an outcome from that era, in fact, that the growth of basic country has to be linked with the Bandung era itself. But today it seems to me that our discussion has very much focused on, I have a feeling that there's more emphasis, there's more emphasis on the question of state, what China may do, what African governments may do. But even Bandung conference will not be possible without the previous mass struggles. So Bandung conference, even though we see on the TV, on the documentary, it's heads of state get together, but they were put there because of the mass movement, because of revolution. So today, when we rethink about what Bandung may mean for us, we think about perhaps, what the state can do. But I think for us, for people here who are, in some ways, perhaps we position ourselves as critical intellectuals, it's not so much what the state do certainly is important, but I think what movements can do. I think this is perhaps I'd like to see some shift in our discussion towards that part. That is, what kind of movements, what kind of alternative networks that are being forged on the ground. And I'll put one just very quickly. I mentioned La Via Campesina. That kind of movement network is the kind of thing, we could see that as also a legacy coming out of Bandung. So out of Bandung, you have sort of state-led development, you have today's basic BRIC countries, but you also have people's network, people's movement, and these things, we have to prioritize the kinds of our own intellectual investment in here. I think that's pretty much it, right? One last sentence. So about China in Africa, then just coming back to that question again, my own position would be that I think China should be constantly facing warnings. The siren should be on, in a sense, because not the kind of siren of China practicing neocolonialism in Africa, but the kind of siren that would make use of Bandung principle as a useful discourse to check on what China is doing in Africa or Latin America. Thank you.
我像那个马老师讲的，我是做这个中国思想史研究的，而且做中国哲学研究的，完全是对非洲、对加勒比那是遥远的国度、遥远的彼岸，根本了解非常少。所以我觉得交给我这么一个难以完成的任务，我该怎么评论？我觉得真是我很费思量哈。但我觉得，不过好歹今天有一个主题叫做万隆会议啊。我觉得我是60年代末出生的人嘛，我觉得我是生长在这个我的童年时代是在这个中国的文革的后期嘛，所以我觉得在我的成长的记忆里边，其实还是有很多美好的亚非拉记忆的。所以我觉得我可以从我自己个人的感受出发，来谈一谈这个亚非拉对我，或者说是可以大言不惭地说，对于我们这代人的意义。我觉得这是一个我觉得大概我可能着手谈一谈的啊。也就是其实对我们来讲，在我自己的这种所谓的文革后期的这样一个亚非拉的记忆里边，我觉得亚非拉对我们来讲其实就是一种情感，一种其实对我们来讲是一种就是可以共同的中国人民和所谓亚非拉人民共同去抵抗压迫的这样一个兄弟感情，对吧？我觉得在我自己的记忆里边，也是一个就是说一个处在社会大多数人民去反对那个社会不正义的、社会不公义的这样一个阶级感情。我觉得这两种感情是完全在一起的，因此才会有所谓的民主解放的这样一个亚非拉背后是这样一个民主解放的这样一个背景。我觉得这种感情上，中国和亚非拉完全是同构的。 所以我觉得在这个上来讲，我觉得亚非拉的记忆对我们来讲就是这样一种情感的记忆。所以我自己其实我自己看到这个黑人兄弟或者拉美的兄弟，我觉得确实我完全是有一种由衷的那种兄弟的情谊。这跟我们在自己的国内看到我们的少数民族的兄弟是一样的。我觉得我在上大学的时候，我有一个我特别喜欢的一个老师。他就讲过一句话，他说他见到少数民族兄弟，他就觉得非常的亲。我觉得这种情感是跟这个文革里边，我觉得跟毛时代留给我们的某种这种，我觉得价值遗产是有关系的。这种情感放大出去，就是对亚非拉的情感，这是一回事哇！我觉得，其实根本就没有3个世界了，今天对吧？我觉得随着苏东的解体，这个所谓的3个世界的划分，在今天来讲，已经没有所谓的3个世界了。今天只有2个世界，而且是由2个相互依赖构成的一个世界，而且这2个世界呢是相互依赖构成的一个世界，这就是南北世界，就是所谓发达国家和发展中国家所构成的世界。而且我们中国自认为自己是发展中国家，而且这种发展中国家的自我认同里边，其实就意味着说，我们永远是要超英赶美的，对吧？我觉得这当然是一方面是感情的回忆，那里面还有一些实际的政治意涵，我觉得可能需要揭示一下。一个就是说，我们知道万隆会议提到的这个独立自主、和平共处的这2个原则。我觉得独立自主、和平共处这2个原则，其实就意味着说，所谓的独立自主，那不就是反霸权吗？我觉得和平共处，其实在今天来讲，其实就是团结的主题嘛。我觉得今天这个前头好几位这个学者都提到了这样2个主题，我觉得特别是提到了团结的主题。那么我就觉得说，反霸权到底意味着是反什么样的霸权？我觉得对于理解所谓的反霸权，反什么样的霸权，其实跟是谁在反霸权和用什么来反霸权的问题是结合在一起的。所以就对我来讲，就是说一种观点是认为说，其实我觉得可能也是一个我多年来讲也是比较对，在所谓的左翼的这个角度来看是比较普遍的一种观点，是说反霸权其实意味着反任何的一切的权利的形式。我觉得这是一种在左翼思想界里边比较被共同接受的一种观点。所以反霸权其实是对所有权利形式的反对和批判。我觉得，但我觉得今天那么在这个上来讲，我觉得今天听了整个一天听下来以后，其实我是非常的受教育的，特别是这个猫友教授和这个叫 Jomo 先生的这个讲演里边提到的很多内容，我觉得对我来讲非常深刻的一个感受是说，其实反霸权对于他们所讲到的这个世界而言，其实是反饥饿，是吧？实际上是反贫困。我觉得是在反这个饥饿和贫困背后的一个不公平的宰制的秩序。那这个宰制的秩序对今天来讲，我们反霸权其实在谋求的是什么？谋求的是一个平等发展的机会，谋求的是一个共同的繁荣嘛。所以说，我觉得这个平等发展和共同繁荣，其实恰恰应该是反霸权背后所指向的那个团结应该针对的那个主题。所以我觉得今天大概是说，对我来讲，今天是很受教育的一点，因为我觉得今天确实提出来这么一个问题，到底我们反霸权反的是什么？其实在很多地方，在非洲、在拉美还有很多地方，还面临的根本的问题是饥饿和贫困的问题，和饥饿和贫困背后的那个世界权利的问题。所以我觉得对我们来讲，今天可能确实还有一个是谁在反霸权？其实是这些承受着饥饿和贫困的这些沉默的人民在反霸权的问题。所以对我们来讲，是这些人民在反霸权的时候，就面临就存在着一个问题，也就是说，上午那个猫药先生讲到的说，万隆会议以后，独立自主确实带来了有2个成就，就是所谓政治自主和反殖民的成果。可问题是，这是远远不够的嘛。我觉得对我们来讲，确实今天我们还面临的一个问题，就是今天我觉得是谁提到的，就是我觉得小丹提到的这个问题是说，其实我们今天其实对于整个亚非拉而言，还有一个如何反对经济殖民的问题嘛。我觉得多年以来，大家对中国在非洲、在拉美的这个发展，其实有很多新殖民主义这样的判断。其实我觉得，其实在中国自己内部也有很多这样的自我批判的声音，因为我对事实我们不做判断，问题在于说我们如何找到一种新的价值来引导这个事实朝向一个合理的、我们值得我们向往的方向去发展。所以我觉得我们知识分子或者像我们这样的人，我们不是投资者，我们不是中国的资本家，我们 不是那个资本的拥有，我们也不是国家的资本背后的拥有者。但对我们来讲，我们的目的是如何我们去引导这样的一个投资的倾向，引导这个国家发展在非洲、在拉美的作为的方向，给它提供一个什么样的价值。所以我觉得今天来讲，其实我觉得大概是这也是我们缅怀万隆的一个目的所在吧。所以我其实我特别喜欢这个白乐琴先生对第三世界的一个定义啊。我觉得白先生讲说，第三世界其实不是三个世界划分里面第三个世界，第三世界应该成为一个构造世界的方式，第三世界应该成为是一个定义世界的方式。也就是说，其实我觉得更重要的一点，对我们来讲，所谓的第三世界，它其实还是那些被这个西方的现代文明所覆盖下面的那个古老文明的基层嘛。那个古老文明的基层里边，而承载这个古老文明的基层，其实是那些沉默的人民嘛。所以我觉得这种第三世界再次去把第三世界作为一个定义世界或者是构造世界的力量的时候，我们应该关注的是这些沉默的基层的人民，是不是能够从他们古老的文明里边去找到一个创造新的世界的可能性嘛？这大概是我觉得讲万隆精神的一个基本的一个出发点。我大概就这么多的一个感想，我就说这么多，因为我觉得更具体的内容我是提不出来了，我只能谈一些这样的感受啊。好，谢谢啊。
I read the Howard French book, raising the alarm about a million Chinese in Africa, etc. And I come from Uganda. In Uganda today, there are, in official statistics, there are 35,000 Chinese, roughly 35,000 people of Indian descent, and roughly 35,000 Europeans and Americans. The Europeans and Americans are in the mainly NGO and big business, etc. And the Indians and Chinese are mainly in retail trade and small business and stuff like that. Uganda also exports people. Remittance is the largest income in our export earnings. And this has been going up over the years. So from my point of view, from the vantage point of Kampala, I see no alarm, in terms of numbers coming in. What I find alarming is that I know that most of the Indians who have come in through human trafficking. In other words, they are the victims of people who sell them to, an opportunity to sort of a ticket. They'll pay $2,000-3,000. They will come to Kampala, pay $50, immigration, come in on a tourist visa, and then they're dumped there. And I suspect that many of the Chinese are victims of similar practices. So Chinese or Indian large businessmen usually would go to a temple or a mosque to find cheap captive labor. And they prefer labor who does not speak a local language because they're completely captive. Okay, so I think we have to explore this thing a little more. That's one thing. Second thing is that I'm surprised nobody talked of the last scramble, which was the superpower rivalry. Right? The US-Soviet rivalry on the African continent. And what is interesting is that now the roles are completely reversed. Because see, last time the Soviet Union was the militarizing power on the African continent. Now the US is the militarizing power. The US seems to have concluded that it cannot really compete with China in terms of the economic fields where China is coming in. And that the way for the US to maintain its hold is to securitize the continent, right? To ensure, not to ensure, but to simply get it to the point where military solutions are not resolved politically, where the presumption is that every military problem needs a military solution. Okay, and we know that even a military problem has to have a political solution, not a military one. So Uganda, again, to come to the example, for example, Uganda has over 10,000 in Iraq, okay, part of the US mercenary force, right? Over 10,000, anywhere from domestic servants, women as maids, to security guards, right? But over 10,000. It has 7,000 in Somalia. It has a few thousand in South Sudan. It has, you know. So this is a relationship which needs to be seen from all sides, in a way. In terms of China, if the real danger of the US is securitization, the real danger of China today on the African continent, I think, is corruption. Increasing levels of facts. But I'm told in Kampala, I'm told by friends in government, that Chinese companies are authorized to use up to 30% of investment as inducement. It'd be very interesting for us to get information from you, you know, as to what is the case. One final comment. I think it would be a mistake to look at this situation simply in terms of phases of capitalist development, because there is a much larger. This change has a huge significance. Okay, it's not simply like the U.S. displacing Britain. This is bringing to a close the phase which began in 1492. This is bringing to a close 500 years of Western dominance. It has huge psychological, cultural, political, not simply economic significance, right? People are terrified in certain parts of the world, and people are very curious and expectant in other parts of the world. And I think that part of the world includes Africa, at least from my vantage point. What I see is people, what we don't know is what is the Chinese vision of a new world. We don't know that, right? I'm not even sure that the Chinese themselves have figured it out, right? What is their vision of a new world? And it would be great for Inter-Asia to tell us something about it.
If you consider the fact that by the time, this time between the end of slavery, say in Brazil, Cuba, and the Bandung Conference is around just a little more than the time between the Bandung Conference and today. The Bandung Conference and today is 60 years. The 1880s, in which decade slavery was abolished in Cuba, Brazil, is about 70 years. So it's a different consideration altogether. And this is where the racial question comes up. In the case of China and the racial question, it's not really a matter of quantitative issues, whether there are X amount of Chinese here or X amount of investments. It is how people perceive the actions of the Chinese population, not so much what objective data you can bring to bear. It is perception. I therefore think that the Bandung principles are urgently in need of application to the relationship between China and Africa and China and peoples of African descent. It is more urgent than I think the discussion I'm hearing implies. Believe you me, whatever data the academics or the bureaucrats have really has very little impact on people because they bring a certain history to bear on Chinese relationship. They have their own local specifics. And of course, these specifics are also filled with anti-Chinese prejudices because they are in the Caribbean. There are anti-Chinese prejudices which affect how people perceive the Chinese in the region. I think this may apply elsewhere as well. The question of the archipelago, I don't know if I quite understand it, but certainly as a small archipelago, the Caribbean embodies literally the main population groups of the world. And that's, again, a creation of the past 4 centuries, and particularly since the 19th century for Asia and the Caribbean. What I would say about the politics of the archipelago, I would say that there have been 2 important revolutions in the Caribbean archipelago. One, the Haitian Revolution, which could not survive and which was defeated in the long run, although it was the first anti-slave rebellion that was successful, but it could not have survived in 19th and 20th century imperialism. When Eastern European communism fell in the late 1980s, early 1990s, a big question mark arose over Cuba. What has happened last week in Panama is of great significance because many people theorize that Cuba, certainly in the 1990s during the special period, would not have made it. So it is, in this sense, Cuba as the political leader in the anti-imperial struggle in the region, and also a big help in terms of the African liberation. Its ability to withstand that 25-year period between 1990 and 2015, and to be able to emerge to achieve what Samir Amin has called a negotiated position with the United States, whose policy failed. I think in terms of the politics of the Caribbean archipelago, it strengthens the position of the Caribbean region, because certainly the Anglophone Caribbean from the 1970s maintained a pretty strong position insofar as it recognized ideological pluralism in the region and gave support to Cuba's right to exist. And countries like Jamaica paid a high price for that in the 1970s. My final response concerns the point about strengthening regionalism. I think whilst the presentation on Latin America this morning could speak very positively about Latin American regionalism and how Latin America has overcome right-wing military regimes and now has pretty strong social democratic oriented regimes. The same cannot be said for the Caribbean, which has gone through and is still going through a period where it's the regional sense of that sub-region, the Anglophone region, is under a lot of strength, a lot of pressure from the political neoliberalism led by the United States. And I think on the narco-trafficking side, the United States has a strong influence on the security policies of Caribbean states. And the Caribbean states have not been what it had in the 1970s when it made decisions with respect to Cuba, which it still maintains. It hasn't been able to formulate a new policy with respect to its interests in the changing world. Now, just briefly on the question of China, since the 2008 financial crisis, were it not for Chinese investments and the support of Venezuela through PetroCaribe, the situation would have been much worse, because aid flows from the United States literally dried up since the 2008 crisis. So there is recognition in the region of the significance of Chinese investments, especially since 2008. Those are basically my response.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Sorry. Start again. Yeah, I agree with the suggestions that one has to bring it all, when we're talking about for Africa itself, slave trade, slavery is a big part of the transition into formal trade and so forth, the mercantilist period, and so no problem with that. I think that the classification is generalized, and the details, I think, the qualifications you raise are important to emphasize with Africa. And of course, yeah, in terms of perceptions, there is a real fear. One of the reasons why Zimbabwe is fairly popular in Africa is because of its response to the land reform and its broader response to Western capital, and the whole indigenization and the rhetoric, if you like, and real actions is about maintaining a strong challenge or a position. Even if it cannot, you could be punching above your weight in in terms of real capacity to implement certain aspects. So, so yes, the point that we find is that in the literature, the study, the way they're discussing China and so forth, it's all very much led by a media discourse, which I think is fairly xenophobic and not adequately grounded even in understanding the perceptions, some of the popular perceptions. I was in Senegal and we were talking in Codestria, and there were divided opinions about certain aspects of the Chinese retail. I mean, this is a country that has been importing anyway, textiles, clothes, and so forth, about what the advantages are. But at the same time, in relation to European imports historically, and the relationship shifting with, say, Indian investments in irrigation and the food, so we have to look deeper, so I think these points, my issue is that apart from a lack of a clear framework in which to really systematically analyze these things, there is a kind of a xenophobia, even on the issue of corruption. Agreed. But the question is that, how much there is the whole so-called extractive initiatives that Blair and his British government and them started before China was in the scene, about extractives, not just about illicit flows, but about tax avoidance. The big issue right now is about tax avoidance. How much money, capital, could be retained in Africa? And in this framework, we are talking about all of these capitals. So the scramble in another way, one of the tools of the scramble is corruption and bribery. And whether one is more than the other and so forth, probably, I think that we need to look at it closely. And certainly, in a case like Angola or Zimbabwe, these are countries which, by the situation, as I said in the morning, as talking about the history of that war against South Africa and against anti-imperialists, and the DRC war and all those, these are countries which have confronted the IMF, World Bank directly, and some of those key countries. So what you have is a situation where China itself, reportedly there's a lot of corruption, right? With the generals, some kind of a primitive accumulation that's happening also, right? But it's not certain that the French companies, oil companies, which have been there for the last, throughout all these civil wars, since 1974, 5, 6, and American companies, on what conditions they have managed to retain space. So I think the method, the frame, the way to study these things, we need to understand it more, including, and I totally agree with that. And now, the question of trade. I'm glad she raised the point about the trade and finance. I see it in a combination. The source of, apart from the fact that a country like Zimbabwe would be on sanctions, was on sanctions, once the land was, was repossessed in Zimbabwe, large-scale farmers moved to try and possess land in the neighboring countries, Mozambique, Zambia, Malawi, and then the whole thing went on and on with South African, Rhodesian, former white Zimbabweans being the maiden hand of land grabs in the rest of the continent. Now, and capital, agrarian or finance capital and broader shifted out of, there was a capital, we call it a capital strike in Zimbabwe. It's not a formal sanctions. The formal sanctions on the Bretton Woods and the credit, but also a sort of strike by capital, pulled out. But, so as you observe, both in terms of tobacco and cotton, you have a resurgence in the, the West regard redistributed land as contested land. So they do not want to see any investment directly in land that has been redistributed. So you have China, but I did mention other semi-peripheries, Singapore, Olam, some Indian company, So you have these, a string of them. If you look, there are about 15 merchants apiece in tobacco and cotton, key exports, in which you have from Asia about 3 or 4, from Europe about 3 or 4, so you have local, domestic, so you have a kind of a reconfiguration of the market itself. It's not very clear. For instance, this market collapses like the cotton has been a disaster, not just for Zimbabwe, for everybody. The prices collapsed in 2011, which means that for the last 3 years or so that, unless you are in the GMO business, as countries such as Mali, and so forth are in the GMO cotton, BT cotton and so forth, you have problems. So it's not necessarily, the trade is not necessarily stable and so forth. But few Anglo-American, even South African businesses would touch Zimbabwe on any of these commodities in 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5. These companies came back when there appeared to be a normalization in 2009. And one way to look at it also is a renegotiated way. This was not a socialist revolution, it was a major redistribution, right? Very confronting capital. But you have a reintegration on different terms with the new agrarian structure and a broader participation even of state companies and so forth. So the idea of a room of maneuver and so forth can be looked at in a more, in a dynamic way. Now, trade, the question about gold, right? The one that relates to your question too, because you see, small and medium scale Chinese capital, to some extent, seem to have access to credit capital. They are able to, it's not just the very informal gold panels. It's like small enterprises that can bring, some equipment, serious stuff that enter into the space of mines. In the case of Zimbabwe, for instance, there are many small mines that had been found to be less productive historically. These are being reworked, and new small traces are being reworked by Chinese in Ghana, and so forth. So this is another area, small-scale mining. But since the collapse of gold, or the price in the last period, there's a sense that there's a retreat a bit. Similarly with, all the commodities, chrome, platinum, But anyway, it's difficult to, the vagaries of the market are difficult to project as to. But the broader point about scramble is the contest and the different measures used by different capitals and the states that back them. It's the broader framework, in which competing and using all sorts of mechanisms. In some of the countries, it's been a continued push. She talks about privatization. Countries like Zambia, at the next throat, were compelled to privatize all these firms. They needed more money to refinance, to clear the debt, and so on. Other countries like Zimbabwe, decided not to sign another structural adjustment in 1996. This is when the crisis actually started. So you see that the conditions created and the tactics or the tools of the scramble, the use of state power and all sorts of other measures, there are many. The same thing goes with land. In terms of land, some of the land grabbing, by all the firms, yeah? Really, it's a classical case of local land-owning families or trustees, chiefs, or being the handmaiden of the state, which has certain kind of extensive powers of, I've seen you use the notion of eminent domain. It's eminent domain and, in fact, statutory specific laws which vest the title ultimately in the state, directly, as not just as eminent domain. So the states have both double legal framework to enable this kind of land grab. And some people say that it's legal. yeah, of course it's by the law, but actually there are so many mechanisms. It's not legitimate, a lot of it. And it doesn't, like a country like Mozambique, for instance, has one of the best laws on land tenure. Just supposed to consult everybody and so forth, but as you know from Japan, between Japan and Brazil and investments there, they have one of the biggest land grabs going on on the continent. So I don't know if there's one last question that I didn't answer. I should just shut up now. Mahmoud, your question about the population is very good. It's finished. I can finish now. Yeah, no, okay, I think so. Thank you.
看这个网络竞争跟目前的这个各个地区的情况，一个非常有意义。对于我来说，允许我介绍我自己的经验吧。简单的，我听到这个第三次的这个词汇，第一次听到这个的是什么时候呢？1974年，那个时候我参与学生运动。所以被抓住，放在监狱啊，在监狱74年年度，听到的时候，我的前辈，他一起在那个时候，他一起在我的监狱，那个时候他的名字很有名的诗人，大家都不知道吧？金基哈金很有名的诗人，他得到这个 Lotus Prize， 知道吗？亚洲。亚细亚、非洲的这个作者联合的作者会议，给他一个很有名的这个洛特斯，这个翻译成中文的话，莲花奖啊。这个时候我那个时候他告诉我，所以我们有兴奋，所以我听到 这个第三世界，我也就兴奋了。被压迫的，他们只是国外的跨界的知识分子，就是文人，支持我们被压迫的，在韩国比较小小的国家的人。之前呢，韩国政府呢，这个5年这个反动会没被拒绝了，因为我们跟美国结盟啊，所以被拒绝了，是不参加。那个时候谈这个玩弄会呢，玩弄精神啊，这个是被禁止的，很危险的。所以70年在监狱听到这个是有点兴奋，所以但是来到这里之前，我跟我的研究生谈一谈，问他们：你的对第三世界的精神的有没有兴趣呢？他说没有意义啊，韩国已经进入到的发达的国家，为什么谈第三世界呢？韩国的年轻人不喜欢，在参加的很多的年轻人不知道他有兴趣不兴趣。但是对我来说，这个谈这个第三世界或者是玩弄精神呢，对我来说好像变成一个就业吧。以后真的谈到这个问题，这个呢，怎么真的把这个变成我的思考的或者是实践的原动力吗？我不太清楚，我继续努力。两个正天，我参加这个继续参加时，我听了很多的情况内容，以后我找答案的话，大家一起共享吧。我建议呢，你们一起考虑一下，对你们来说，第三世界怎么样？给你的这个就业吧。好，谢谢。